I'm Marguerite Selby, and I'm 52 years old. I started out as an 18-year-old deckhand with a single sea bag to my name, and I spent 34 years earning my way up to command of an entire carrier strike group. For all those years, I gave the Navy everything I had, and I carried one standard that a hard old master chief drove into me on a rainy quarterdeck when I was young. But when I walked up to the brow of my own flagship in civilian clothes and the man on watch told me I did not belong on it and laughed in my face, I had to decide in about 10 seconds what kind of commander I was going to be. Have you ever been dismissed by someone who had no idea who you really were? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You are not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you have ever had to hold your head high after being underestimated, hit that like button and subscribe. The morning after I took command, the sea was flat as a coin. I stood in the flag cabin with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand and watched the light come up gray and even over water that did not have a single wrinkle in it. And I understood standing there that no one on that ship would ever again meet me at a door and ask what I thought I was doing there. It is a strange thing to feel that arrive. I had spent 34 years earning it, and when it came quietly, the way most true things do, on a morning when nobody was watching me at all. A day earlier, a man had stood at the top of that ship's brow and told me I did not belong on it. I want to tell you the whole of it, because the ending only means anything if you know where it began, and it did not begin in a flag cabin. It began on a bus, in the rain, with a girl who owned one bag. I was 18 the first time I stood at the foot of a brow and did not know that I was supposed to ask permission to come aboard. It was 1992. I had grown up in a small town on the water in Washington state, the kind of place where the men went out on boats and came back smelling of diesel and salt, and I had wanted, for as long as I could remember, to go somewhere the town could not follow me. So I enlisted the summer I finished high school, and the Navy sent me to a destroyer tied up in Puget Sound that looked, from the pier, like a gray wall somebody had floated. I walked up to it with my sea bag on my shoulder and my orders in my hand, and I started up the brow, and a voice stopped me before my boot hit the second board. A boatswain's mate the size of a door told me to go back down, face the flag at the stern, salute it, and then request permission to come aboard and to do it like I meant it. I had no idea what any of that meant. I did it anyway. That was the first lesson the Navy ever gave me, and I have never forgotten it. The brow is not a set of stairs. The brow is where the ship decides who you are. The man who taught me what that meant was Master Chief Silas Boone. He was a boatswain's mate, which on a ship is the oldest trade there is. The people who handle the lines and the anchors and the small boats and the honors, the people whose hands keep the ship tied to the world. Boone ran the deck division the way a man runs the thing he loves and does not trust anyone else to love correctly. He was hard. He was completely fair. Those two things sound like they should cancel each other out, and in most people they do, but in Boone they made one solid thing you could stand on in any weather. He worked me until my hands cracked. He taught me to throw a heaving line, to splice, to coil a line so it would run free and not foul, to hold the quarterdeck watch in the middle of the night when the ship was asleep and the only sounds were the generators in the water. He taught me that the sailor standing the watch at the brow is not a doorman. That sailor is the ship's honor, made temporarily into a person. Everything a stranger will ever think about the ship, they think in the first 10 seconds at the brow. The brow is where the ship decides who you are, seaman, he told me once, in the rain, both of us soaked through, watching a working party drag stores aboard. You treat every soul crossing it like they might outrank God, because one day, one of them will, and you will not know it by looking, and the only thing that will save you is having treated the last 100 people right. I was 20 years old, and I thought it was just something old chiefs said. I spent 2 years on that deck, and by the end of it I could stand a quarterdeck watch in my sleep, and I understood the ship the way you understand a house you grew up in. And Boone, who did not hand out praise the way other men handed out cigarettes, started telling me I was wasting myself. He said I had the thing that could not be taught, and I was letting the Navy spend it on line handling. He wanted me to put in for a commissioning program, to go get a degree and come back an officer. I told him no. I told him officers were a different kind of person than me, that they came from a different kind of town than mine, that I was a deck plate sailor, and I would stay one. He listened to all of it, and then he told me I was a coward, which was the only genuinely cruel thing he ever said to me. And he said it because he knew it was the only word that would move me. It moved me. I did not know, standing on that deck at 20, that I would spend the next 3 decades climbing a ladder Boone pointed me at, and that at the very top of it, with 2 stars on my collar and command of an entire strike group in my hand, I would walk up to a brow one more time and meet a man who had forgotten the one lesson Boone spent 2 years driving into me. I did not know that the last door anyone would ever slam in my face would be the door to my own flagship. I only knew, that morning in the rain, that a man I respected more than my own father had just called me a coward, and that he was right, and that I was going to do something about it. That is where it starts. A brow, a bag, and a Master Chief who would not let me be small. I put in for the program the next month. In 2000, at 26, I finished my degree and raised my right hand again, and they put a single gold bar on my collar and called me an ensign, and I walked back onto a ship as an officer for the first time. I would like to tell you that the moment I crossed over into the wardroom, the world stopped deciding for me what I could and could not be. It did not. It never has. That is the thread that runs through this whole story. So I want to lay it down plainly now, before we get to the brow. No matter how far I climbed, there was always someone waiting at the top of the next flight of stairs, ready to look at me and decide, in a half a second, that I could not be the thing I already was. When I was a lieutenant, a shipyard worker handed me his coffee order because he assumed I was there to fetch it. When I was a lieutenant commander running an engineering department, a visiting congressman's aide asked me kindly where the real officers were. When I took command of a destroyer at 41, a contractor on the pier asked to speak to the captain, and when I told him he was speaking to her, he laughed because he thought I was making a joke, and then he saw that I was not, and the laugh died in an ugly way on his face. I got very used to that particular death of a laugh. I could set my watch by it. I want to be careful here because this is not a story about being wounded. Every one of those moments was small. Any one of them, alone, is nothing, is a shrug, is a thing you forget by lunch. But they stack. 30 years of them stack into something you carry. And the thing you learn to carry it with is not anger. Anger is heavy and it spoils. What you learn to carry it with is a kind of quiet, and the quiet is not weakness. The quiet is the most disciplined thing I own. By 2026, I was 52 years old, and I wore 2 stars. Rear Admiral, upper half. I had commanded a destroyer and a cruiser and a shore staff. I had been selected for flag. And now the Navy had handed me the thing I had wanted since I was a girl, watching gray ships come home to a small town. Command of a carrier strike group. A carrier, her air wing, her escorts, thousands of sailors, moving together across the ocean as one weapon and one community. It is the kind of command that comes to very few people, and it had come to a boatswain's mate striker from a fishing town, and I still some mornings did not entirely believe it. The change of command was set for a Friday. The plan, the way these things are always planned, was full of ceremony. There would be honors at the brow, side boys, a piped arrival, an aide at my elbow, the whole apparatus that the Navy uses to move a flag officer around so that everyone knows a flag officer is being moved. My flag aide, a sharp young lieutenant commander named Delia Voss, had it timed to the minute. And I told her I wanted to come aboard a day early, alone, in civilian clothes, with no honors and no warning and no one bracing. Delia looked at me like I had asked her to swim to the ship. "Admiral," she said, "they'll want to render honors. The quarterdeck will expect it. It's cleaner if you arrive on the schedule." "I know they'll expect it," I said. "That's exactly why I don't want it. I want to meet the ship the way I met my first ship. On foot, unannounced, nobody standing at attention because a message told them to." I had a video call that week with the man I was inheriting as my chief of staff, a captain named Brant Olson. Olson was correct in every possible way, which is a specific kind of person you meet in the military, a person for whom the schedule is a moral document. He did not like my plan. He did not say so directly because captains do not tell admirals they dislike their plans. But he found 3 separate ways to suggest that arriving off the schedule would create confusion, and that confusion at a change of command reflected on everyone, and that it would be cleaner, so much cleaner if I simply came aboard when the ship was ready for me. "We can have the quarterdeck expecting you at any hour you like, Admiral," he said. "Just say the word and they'll be ready." "I don't want them ready, Captain," I said. "I want to see the ship when it thinks no one important is looking. That's when you find out what a ship actually is. He did not understand. I did not expect him to. Olson had come up a smooth ladder, the kind where the rungs are exactly where you expect them, and he had never once, I would have bet my stars on it, walked up to a brow as a nobody and been told to go back down and salute the flag. There was one more reason I wanted to do it that way, and it was the realest one, and I did not tell Olson about it. Silas Boone had died 2 years before, at 76, in a small house near the water not far from where I grew up. I had gone to the funeral in my dress blues and stood at the back and cried where no one could see me, because that is the thing he would have understood. He left me exactly one object. His boatswain's pipe, the little silver whistle that boatswain's mates use to sound the honors, worn smooth by 50 years of his thumb. It came in a padded envelope with a note in his hard block handwriting that said only, "Keep the standard." I wanted to carry that standard onto my new ship in the plainest way I knew. Not as an admiral, as the sailor he made. So I put on jeans and a plain jacket, and I put his pipe in my pocket, and I got on a red-eye with a sea bag on my shoulder. No stars, no aid, no schedule, and I flew across the country to be nobody for one more night. The pier at 05:15 in the morning is one of the loneliest places on earth. I came out of the taxi into the sodium light and the cold, and there she was. My ship. A carrier does not look like a ship from the pier. She looks like a cliff of steel somebody has moored to the land. A black wall going up and up into the dark, dotted with small yellow lights, humming with the low, constant sound that big ships make even when they're sleeping. I stood there for a minute with my sea bag on my shoulder and just looked at her, and I felt the thing I have felt at the foot of every brow since I was 18. Small, and glad to be small, in front of something that large. Then I walked up to the foot of the brow and I started up. There was a watch team at the top under the light, and the petty officer of the watch was a senior chief, a boatswain's mate by the crossed anchors on him, and he was immaculate. I will give him that. His uniform was sharp, his posture was correct, and he saw me coming up out of the dark in my jeans and my plain jacket, a middle-aged woman with a bag, and he made his decision about me before I was halfway up. I have watched people make that decision about me for 30 years. I know exactly what it looks like on a face. He stepped to the top of the brow and put his body in the center of it so that I could not pass, and he held up one hand. "Ma'am," he said, and the way he said it was not a courtesy, it was a wall. "You don't belong on this brow. Civilians turn around. This is a United States warship, not a tour." His name tape said, "Pruitt." I stopped where I was, one hand on the rail, and I looked at him, and I want you to understand that in that moment I was not angry. I was somewhere much stranger than angry, because I had stood in exactly the spot he was standing in, on a brow very like this one, 34 years before, in the rain, and a master chief named Silas Boone had spent 2 years teaching me to never, ever do what this man was doing. And here it was, coming back at me at the very top of my career, out of the mouth of a man wearing the same crossed anchors Boone wore. "Senior Chief," I said, and I kept my voice level, because level is the most powerful thing you can be at a moment like that. "I'd like you to call your officer of the deck, please." He laughed. It was not a big laugh. It was worse than a big laugh. It was a small, private, amused sound, the sound a man makes when he has decided you are a minor problem and he is enjoying being the solution to you. "The officer of the deck," he repeated, like I had asked to see the president. "Ma'am, I don't know how you got down to this pier, but you need to turn around and go back the way you came before I call somebody who's going to be a lot less friendly than me." There was a young sailor behind him at the watch desk, a seaman, small and dark-haired, and her name tape said Nakamura, and I watched her face while this was happening. She was maybe 20, and I watched her start to understand that something was wrong, that a woman did not walk onto a carrier pier at 5 a.m. with a sea bag and orders in her jacket for no reason, that the ordinary explanation did not fit. She half lifted a hand. "Senior Chief," she said, "maybe we should—" "Stow it, Nakamura," Pruitt said, without turning around. And that, honestly, was the moment that decided everything that came after. Not the way he treated me, the way he treated her. Because a man who will silence his own junior for trying to do the right thing is a man who has forgotten what the watch is for, and that is a much bigger problem than one rude morning, and it is the problem I would eventually make him look at. I did not raise my voice. I did not reach for the orders in my jacket. I have learned that the worst thing you can do to a moment like that is feed it, and the second worst thing is to win it cheaply. So I simply stood there, one hand on the rail, and let the silence do its work, and the silence started to frighten him a little, I think, because people who are certain do not like it when you refuse to be frightened back. And then a fourth person came out onto the quarterdeck to see what was holding up the brow. A lieutenant, young, sharp, the officer of the deck with the long glass under his arm and the sword belt of the watch. His name was Cho. He came up beside Pruitt and looked down the brow to see what the problem was, and he looked at me, and I watched it happen. I watched his eyes go to my face and stop, and I watched the color drain right out of him. Because he had spent the last week reading the change of command brief, and the brief has a photograph in it, and he was looking at the photograph. For 1 full second, nobody moved. Then Lieutenant Cho did the thing that told me the ship, underneath everything, was sound. He did not stammer. He did not apologize. He came to attention so fast his heels cracked, and he turned to the watch, and his voice came out of him like a bell. "Attention on the quarterdeck," he said. "Boatswain, honors." Nakamura already had the pipe to her lips. She had known. She had known for 30 seconds and been told to stow it. The boatswain's pipe went up into the dark over the pier, that high, ancient climbing call that has sounded on the world's quarterdecks for 500 years. And then the bell began to ring, and the words came over the ship's announcing system, out of every speaker on that black cliff of steel, rolling down the pier into the morning. Carrier Strike Group 15, arriving, 6 bells. And every sailor on that quarterdeck locked at rigid attention, and Senior Chief Dwight Pruitt stood frozen at the top of his own brow, his hand still half raised, as the ship he thought he was guarding announced to the world exactly who it was he had just turned away. I have thought a great deal since that morning about what a lesser version of me would have done in the next 10 seconds. There was a version of that moment available to me that would have felt wonderful. I could have walked up that brow slowly, taken my time, let him stew, and said something sharp and final in front of his whole watch. The line was right there. I could feel it in my mouth. Every person who has ever been made small knows the taste of that line. I did not say it, and I want to tell you honestly why, because it is the center of this whole thing. I did not say it because of Nakamura, and because of Boone, and because of a lesson that runs deeper than any grudge. The brow is where the ship decides who you are, not just who the visitor is, who the ship is. The watch team was standing there at rigid attention, watching their new admiral, and whatever I did in the next 10 seconds was going to teach every one of them what kind of commander had just come aboard. If I humiliated Pruitt, I would win the morning and lose the thing I actually wanted, which was a ship that ran right because the people on it believed in the standard, not because they were afraid of me. So I did the thing you were supposed to do. I walked up the brow at a normal pace, and at the top I stopped, and I turned aft toward the national ensign hanging in the floodlight at the stern, and I saluted it, the way Boone taught me in the rain when I was 18. Then I turned to Lieutenant Cho, and I saluted him. "I request permission to come aboard," I said. "Permission granted, Admiral," Cho said, and his voice only shook a little. I stepped onto the deck of my flagship. And I did every single thing that Senior Chief Pruitt, 90 seconds earlier, had been completely certain a civilian woman with a bag could not possibly know how to do. I did not look at him while I did it. I think that was harder on him than looking would have been. By then, the word had already run up into the ship the way word does, faster than any person can walk, and Captain Lorne Fairbanks, the commanding officer of the carrier, came down to the quarterdeck at something close to a run, still getting his arms into his uniform. He was an aviator, 50 years old, a good man having the worst morning of his command. He came up in front of me, and I could see him deciding whether to have his own quarterdeck watch relieved on the spot in front of me. "Admiral," he said, "I am so sorry. This is not how—" "Captain," I said quietly so that it was between us and not for the watch. "Your ship rendered honors correctly and fast from a cold start at 5 a.m. for someone nobody was expecting. That is what I am going to remember about this morning. Walk with me." I saw the relief go through him, and underneath the relief, something steadier. The beginning of the understanding between a strike group commander and her flagship captain that would have to carry us through a whole deployment. He walked me up into the ship, and behind us the quarterdeck came off attention, and I did not look back at Pruitt, and not looking at him was the loudest thing I did all morning. We got up to the flag spaces, and over the next hour the rest of my staff arrived, the schedule catching up to me, and among them was Delia Voss, my aide, who took one look at the duty log and figured out in about 4 seconds what had happened at the brow. Delia is loyal in the way that young, excellent officers are loyal, which is to say fiercely and a little bit dangerously, and she wanted somebody's head. "He did what?" she said in the flag cabin, keeping her voice down, but only barely. "Admiral, he refused you the brow. He laughed at you? Say the word. I will have the command master chief in here before you finish your coffee, and that senior chief will be counting mooring lines in a very cold place by lunch." "Sit down, Delia," I said. She sat down. She did not want to. "I know exactly what you want," I told her. "You want a head on a plate. I understand it. 2 years ago I might have wanted it too, but I want a ship that runs right, and those are not the same thing, and the second one is a great deal harder to get than the first." I sat down at the flag cabin desk, and I opened the top drawer, and I put Silas Boone's boatswain's pipe in it. The little worn silver whistle. "Keep the standard," and I looked at it for a while. Delia watched me do it and did not ask what it was, because she is smart enough to know when a thing is private. The truth is, I was not thinking about Pruitt much at all in that hour. I was thinking about how many times in 30 years I had been the person nobody recognized. The lieutenant with the coffee order, the captain the contractor laughed at. I knew, better than almost anyone alive, exactly what it feels like to have someone look at you and decide you are less than you are. And I knew something else, too. Something you only learn if you have been on the receiving end enough times. The person who does that to you is almost never a monster. He is usually just a person who got comfortable, who stopped doing the hard work of seeing people, who let his certainty do his thinking for him. You do not fix that person by breaking him. You fix him, if you can fix him at all, by making him stand in the truth until he sees it. So I made a decision, sitting at that desk with a dead man's whistle in the drawer. I was not going to destroy Dwight Pruitt. I was going to do something he would find much harder to live with. I was going to hold him to the exact standard he had failed, and I was going to let him feel the whole weight of it, and I was not going to give him the gift of being able to tell himself he had been treated unfairly. Not vengeance, not a scene. Just the standard, applied all the way down, the way Boone would have applied it to me. Later that first day, once the ship had settled and the immediate business of a strike group commander reporting aboard was done, I sat down with Captain Fairbanks and the carrier's command master chief, a steady man in his late 40s who had clearly already heard every version of the morning that existed, and was braced for me to demand a scalp. I did not demand a scalp. I demanded something that surprised both of them more. "I don't want Senior Chief Pruitt made an example of," I told them. "I want to know why. I want to know why a senior chief, a boatswain's mate, a man who has stood more quarterdeck watches than most of this crew has been alive, looked at a person he did not recognize and decided the brow was his to gatekeep. That is not a rudeness problem. That is a leadership problem, and if he has it, other people caught it from him. And I want to find the source, not just the symptom. Start with how the quarterdeck watch is trained on this ship. Then look honestly at his record and how he leads. Not to bury him, to find out the truth." The command master chief looked at me for a long moment, and then he nodded, slowly, and I saw that I had earned something from him that I could not have earned by being angry. Not everyone was pleased with that approach. Captain Olson, my chief of staff, came to me that afternoon with a different idea, delivered in his correct and reasonable voice. He wanted the whole thing to simply go away. No counseling, no paper, no record. For the good of the change of command, he said. For the optics. It would not do, 3 days before I formally took command, for the story to get around that the new admiral's first morning had been a scene at the brow. "We can make this morning disappear, Admiral," he said. "No one outside that watch team needs to know it happened. Clean slate for everybody." "No," I said. He blinked. I do not think people told Captain Olson no very often. "I don't want it to disappear, Captain," I said. A cover-up and a punishment look like opposite things, but they are the same mistake. They are both about protecting somebody, him or me, or you or the ceremony, instead of protecting the truth. I don't want this morning erased, and I don't want it avenged. I want it to be true. I want an honest record of what happened and an honest look at why, and then I want the system to do exactly what the system is designed to do. No more and no less. If that is inconvenient for the optics can be inconvenienced. Olson did not like it, but he was, in the end, a professional, and he heard something in it that made him stop arguing. I think it was the first time he understood that the plainclothes arrival had not been an eccentricity. It had been the whole point. I had wanted to see the ship when it thought no one important was watching, and I had seen it, and now I was going to hold every part of it, including myself, to what I saw. Word of all of this reached Pruitt the way things reach a man in the modern Navy, which is to say slowly, and then all at once. First he learned that the woman at the bow had been the incoming strike group commander, which he already knew from the bells, and which had made him physically ill by his own later account. Then he waited for the axe. He was certain the axe was coming. A man like Pruitt understands the world as a place where power, when it is wronged, strikes back, because that is how he would have used power. He spent 2 days waiting to be crushed, rehearsing his defense, telling himself the story in which he had been reasonable, and I had been unreasonable to be out of uniform on a pier at dawn. And the axe did not come. Instead, he was brought before his own chain of command, calmly, and asked to account for how he led the quarterdeck watch. Not ambushed, not screamed at. Just asked by his own master chief to explain his standard in a quiet office on the record. I was told later that it was the quiet that undid him. He had built a defense against an attack, and no attack came, and a defense against an attack is useless against a simple, level question about whether you have been doing your job the way you know it should be done. Somewhere in that conversation, with no one raising a voice, Dwight Pruitt ran out of story. He stopped being a man who had been treated unfairly by a vindictive admiral because there was no vindictive admiral anywhere in the room, and he was left standing in the plain fact of what he had done at the brow, with nothing to push against. And Nakamura. I made sure quietly that the record showed the one thing that mattered most to me about that morning, that the youngest, most junior person on that watch, a seaman with 3 stripes, had been the only one on the brow who tried to do the right thing, and had been told to stow it. I did not make a fuss of it, I just made sure it was written down true, because true things being written down is how a ship remembers what it values. The consequences, when they came through the system, which is the only place I ever wanted them to come from. There was a formal counseling, documented, honest, and there was a genuine look at Senior Chief Pruitt's leadership of the watch. And both of those things went into the record that follows a career. I want to be precise about what that means because it is easy to say and hard to feel. Pruitt was at the top of the enlisted ranks, a senior chief, on a ladder that in his mind led straight up to Master Chief, to the anchor with 2 stars, to the pinnacle of the profession he had given his life to. He had assumed that ladder was his by right, that his time at the top of a brow had earned it permanently. And now there was a mark on the record, a true mark that said this man let his certainty do his thinking, that he silenced a junior for trying to do right, that he forgot what the watch is for. That mark does not destroy a career, but it stalls one. It makes the board that decides who becomes a master chief pause and read and wonder, and Pruitt knew it. His world cracked. Not because I attacked it. I never touched it. It cracked because the standard he had spent 20 years ignoring in himself, while enforcing it on everyone below him, finally got applied to him, and it turned out to be load-bearing. The men who had watched him run that quarterdeck like a private kingdom, who had laughed at his jokes and covered his edges, went quiet around him. Not cruel, just quiet. A ship knows. A ship always knows. And I did the thing that was, in some ways, the hardest part of all. I let it be, and I went and did my actual job. Because here is what people who have never held a real command do not understand. The revenge fantasy, the scene at the brow, the sharp line, the public unmaking, all of that lives in a world where you have nothing else to do but nurse the wrong that was done to you. I did not live in that world. I had a strike group to take to sea. I had thousands of sailors, an air wing working up, escorts to shepherd, 100 decisions a day that were the actual weight and substance of command. Within the week, we were formally chopped and moving, the ship coming alive under me, and the brow incident receded behind the enormous, absorbing, ordinary work of running a fleet at sea. That is its own kind of justice, and it is the truest kind. The wrong that was done to me became very quickly the least important thing about my day. But the story traveled, the way stories travel on a ship, better than any message system the Navy has ever built. 10,000 people cannot keep a secret, and they did not try to. The tale of the admiral who was turned away at her own brow, and who did not burn the man who did it, went all the way through that ship in about 3 days. And I watched, from the distance a flag officer always keeps, the crew recalibrate around it. What they took from it was not what Pruitt would have taught them. Pruitt, if he had been the admiral, would have taught them do not cross the powerful, because the powerful will end you. That is a lesson that makes a ship afraid and small. What they took instead was something Boone would have recognized. They learned that the brow belongs to the ship and not to the person standing on it. They learned that the standard applies all the way up and all the way down, to a seaman and to a senior chief and to a 2-star admiral in blue jeans, and that it does not bend for anyone's certainty. They learned that the woman commanding them would rather have the truth than a scalp. You cannot order a crew to believe that. You can only show them once when it costs you something and then let it travel. Captain Olson, of all people, was the one who said it to me plainly. We were going over the next week's schedule, the ordinary business of a chief of staff and his admiral, and at the end of it, he closed his folder and sat for a second, which was not like him. Then he said, "Admiral, I owe you something. I wanted that morning buried. I thought you were going to make the whole ship pay for a bad 10 seconds, and I was wrong on both counts. You did not bury it, and you did not weaponize it." I have served 30 years, and I am not sure I had ever actually seen the difference between those two things until I watched you refuse both of them. He is a correct man, Olson, and it cost a correct man something to say that, and I told him so. And I told him that the difference he had just named was the only thing I had ever really been trying to teach anyone. He nodded and picked his folder back up, and we went back to the schedule, but something had shifted, and it held for the rest of the deployment. I saw Pruitt myself only once during that stretch, and I do not think he saw me. It was dusk, and I was coming back from the bridge, and he was on the fantail alone, coiling a line. A senior chief does not have to coil his own lines. There are a dozen juniors whose job that is. But there he was, at the end of a long day, doing the humblest task on the ship with his own hands, faking the coils down carefully so the line would run free and not foul, exactly the way I had been taught to do it at 18, exactly the way you do it when you are trying to remember in your hands what the work is actually for. He was not doing it because anyone was watching. He did not know I was there. He was doing it because it was right, and because it was the one thing on that ship he still knew, beyond any doubt, how to do correctly. I stood in the shadow of the island for a moment and watched a proud man relearn the smallest lesson of his trade, and I did not feel triumph. I felt something much quieter and much better. I felt the standard doing its work, which is the only thing I had ever wanted it to do. A little over 2 weeks into the deployment, Senior Chief Pruitt requested to speak with me. It is not a small thing for an enlisted sailor to ask to see the strike group commander directly. It goes against every instinct the chain of command builds into you. But he asked through the proper channels, and I said yes, and one evening he came up to the flag spaces and stood in front of my desk at attention, and I told him to stand at ease, and he did, though not very much at ease. I want to tell you what the scene was not, because you have probably seen the fake version of it many times. It was not a groveling scene. He did not weep. I did not forgive him in a warm rush and send him off redeemed. That is not how two people who have both stood the quarterdeck watch talk to each other, and it is not how respect actually gets rebuilt. Respect does not get rebuilt with a hug. It gets rebuilt with a standard and time. "Admiral," he said, "I asked to see you because I owe you a thing I can only say to your face. I was wrong at the brow, and I have spent 2 weeks telling myself that I would have caught it, that in another second I'd have seen who you were and squared it away." He stopped. His jaw worked. "That's a lie, ma'am. I've turned it over 100 times. I wouldn't have caught it. I decided who you were before you were halfway up. I've probably been deciding who people are like that for years. I just never got shown the bill before." I let that sit for a moment because it deserved to sit. "You know who taught me the brow, Senior Chief?" I said. "A Master Chief Boatswain's mate named Silas Boone, 34 years ago. I was a seaman with a bag, exactly like the one I was carrying that morning. And if Boone had been standing where you were standing and watched a senior chief do what you did, he would have relieved you on the spot, right there, in front of the watch. He was not a gentleman." I paused. "I'm not going to do that. I am not him. But I keep his standard, and his standard is the reason you are still a senior chief and not a story people tell. So here is what earning it back looks like. It does not look like apologizing to me. I am not the one you have to square it with. You square it with the brow. You go stand that watch, and you train those juniors, and you make that quarterdeck the best-run brow in the fleet, and you do it not because I am watching, but because it is right. Do that for a year, and you will not owe me anything. Meet the standard, that is the whole of it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Aye, ma'am." And it was not the reflexive ace of a man saying what he has to say. It was the eye of a man taking an order he intended to keep. There was one more piece of business that mattered to me more than any of it, and it did not involve Pruitt at all. It involved the seaman. A few days later, I found a reason to have Seaman Nakamura brought up to the flag spaces, and I talked to her for a few minutes, just the two of us. "You tried to speak up on that brow," I said. "You were the most junior person standing there. You had the most to lose, and you were the only one who tried to do the right thing. And you got told to stow it. I want you to know that I saw that, and that it is written down, and that it is the single most important thing that happened that morning." She did not know what to do with that. She was 20. "I didn't really do anything, Admiral," she said. It didn't feel right." "That's the whole job, Nakamura," I told her. "Feeling when it doesn't feel right, and opening your mouth even when it costs you something. That is the entire thing. Most people spend a career learning to unfeel it. Don't. Whatever else you do in this Navy, don't lose that." She went back to her watch section a little taller than she had come, and I sat for a while after she left and thought about a rainy quarterdeck 34 years gone, and a master chief who had seen the same thing in a seaman that I had just seen in Nakamura, and who had refused to let her make herself small. That is the whole secret of it, if there is a secret. Nobody climbs alone. Somebody sees the thing in you before you can see it in yourself, and they name it, and then you spend the rest of your life trying to be worthy of having been seen. Boone did that for me. I had just done a small piece of it for a seaman on a brow. The ledger does not balance in one lifetime. It is not supposed to. You take what you are given, and you pass it down, and you die owing more than you paid, and that is not a tragedy. That is the arrangement, and it is a good one. And Pruitt, over the weeks that followed, did exactly what I told him to do. I did not check up on him. I did not have to. The Command Master Chief mentioned once in passing that the quarterdeck watch had gotten noticeably sharper, and that the senior chief running it had started teaching the juniors things that were not in any instruction, things about what the watch means, why the brow matters, how you treat a stranger you do not recognize. He had, it seemed, remembered the lesson, or maybe learned it for the first time. Sometimes those are the same thing. The weeks turned into the long, steady rhythm of a strike group at sea, and the morning at the brow settled into its proper size, which was small. That is the thing time does to a wound if you let it, if you do not keep the wound open by picking at it. It shrinks the wound down to its true dimensions, and its true dimension was one bad 10 seconds on a pier, set against 34 years and thousands of good ones. We were deep in it by then, the real work. Flight operations around the clock, the deck a controlled kind of thunder, aircraft coming off the bow and dropping onto the wire, the escorts holding their stations out on the dark water, the whole formation moving together across the ocean the way I had dreamed about from a pier in a small town when I was a girl. There is no feeling like it that I have ever found. To stand on the bridge wing at night and feel 100,000 tons of ship and steel and people answering to your intent is a thing very few human beings get to feel. And I never once took it for granted, not for a single watch. I went out onto the bridge wing one night, late, when the ship was quiet in the way a warship is ever quiet, which is not silent but settled, and I stood there with the wind coming over the bow and the wake glowing faintly green behind us all the way back to the horizon. And I let myself, for a few minutes, take the whole thing in, not just the deployment, the whole arc of it. An 18-year-old on a brow in the rain, being taught to salute a flag she did not understand yet. A lieutenant handed a coffee order. A commander a contractor laughed at. Every rank I ever earned, someone had met me at a door and told me, in one way or another, that it could not really be mine. And this last one, at the top of it all, at the top of a black cliff of steel that was now mine to command, had been the loudest of them. A man at a brow telling a 2-star admiral she did not belong on her own ship. And it had ended the most quietly of all of them. That was the part I turned over, out on the wing, in the wind. The smallest dismissals in my life, the coffee order, the laugh on the pier, those I had answered sharply when I was younger because they were small enough to answer sharply without cost. The biggest one, the loudest one, The one with an audience and bells and a whole ship watching, that one I had answered with almost nothing at all, with a salute and a request to come aboard and the patient application of a standard. And it had worked better than any sharp answer I ever gave in my life. There is a lesson in that, and I was 52 years old before I fully learned it. I had Boone's boatswain's pipe with me on the wing that night. I had taken to carrying it in my pocket, the way I had carried it aboard, the worn little silver whistle with "Keep" the standard folded up in the drawer beside where it had lived. And I stood there turning it over in my fingers, and I thought about the fact that it had been sitting in a drawer in my cabin for the whole deployment, in a drawer. The pipe that Silas Boone put to his lips on 1,000 quarterdecks, that sounded honors for admirals and sideboys and the dead being carried ashore. The pipe that was the whole trade made into one object, and I had it in a drawer like a keepsake. That was wrong, and standing on the wing that night, I understood it was wrong. A boatswain's pipe is not a keepsake. It is a working tool, and it belongs on the brow in the hands of the watch, sounding the honors of a living ship. Boone would have been appalled to know his was in a drawer. He would have told me so, in language I cannot repeat, and he would have been right. Delia Voss found me out there, the way a good aide always seems to know where her admiral has gone. She did not say anything for a while, which is one of the reasons she is a good aide. She just stood at the rail beside me and looked at the wake. Delia had been angry on my behalf that first morning, angrier than I had let her stay, and I knew part of her had never fully understood why I had not let her go, get the head she wanted to go get. "You still think I got it wrong, don't you?" I said. "The brow, Pruitt, all of it." She took a moment. "No, Admiral," she said. "I thought so for about a week. I wanted him gone. But I have watched this ship for 2 months now, and I have watched the way the crew looks at you, and I understand it now. If you had burned him, they would have followed you out of fear. Instead, they follow you because they saw you turn down the easy thing." She paused. "I am going to remember that. When it is my turn, I hope I am strong enough to turn down the easy thing." "You will be," I told her, and I meant it. The only reason I could do it is that somebody showed me it was possible, a long time ago. Now you have seen it too. That is how it moves. One brow at a time. She smiled at that, a little, and we stood there in the wind together. And I thought about how the standard does not just go down a ladder. It goes sideways and forward into people you did not even know you were teaching. There was going to be a ceremony on the quarterdeck in a few weeks. Nakamura was up for advancement, and there would be a small ceremony to pin on her new rank on the quarterdeck, at the brow, where it should be. And I stood on the bridge wing turning Boone's pipe over in my hand, and I knew exactly what I was going to do with it, and where it belonged, and I felt the last piece of that morning at the brow settle into place. And I went below to sleep better than I had slept in weeks. The ceremony was small, the way the best ceremonies are. A gray afternoon, the ship steaming easy, the quarterdeck rigged clean, a handful of people gathered at the brow where, a couple of months before, I had been told I did not belong. Seaman Nakamura stood in front of me in her dress uniform, and I pinned on her new rank myself, which is not something a strike group commander usually does for a junior advancement, and everyone there understood exactly why I was doing it, and no one said a word about it, which was right. She had earned it on her own merits, and I made sure the pin was the only thing about the moment that referred to that morning. When it was done, she looked at the deck for a second and then looked back up at me, and I gave her the smallest nod, and that was the whole of it, and it was enough. Senior Chief Pruitt ran the watch for the ceremony. He ran it beautifully. The brow was sharp, the honors were crisp, the juniors under him moved like people who had been taught by someone who cared whether they were good. He and I did not have a warm moment. We are not going to be friends, Dwight Pruitt and I. But at one point, as the ceremony was breaking up, our eyes met across the quarterdeck, and he came to attention, and he saluted me, and I returned it, and in that exchange was everything that needed to be there. Two people who both know what the brow is, holding the same standard, on the same ship. That is not friendship. It is something more useful than friendship. It is trust, rebuilt from the deck up, the only way it can be. And then I did the thing I had come out onto that quarterdeck to do. I took Silas Boone's boatswain's pipe out of my pocket, the worn little silver whistle, and I gave it to the watch, to live on the brow, where it belonged. I did not make a speech. I am not a speech maker. I told them the short version, which was true, that the pipe had belonged to a Master Chief boatswain's mate named Silas Boone, who taught a seaman with a bag, a very long time ago, that the brow is where the ship decides who you are. That he was gone now, That the pipe was a working tool and not a keepsake, and it was staying here, on this brow, in the hands of this watch, and they were to use it, and keep the standard that came with it. This belonged to the man who taught me that the brow decides who you are, I said. It stays here now. Keep the standard. Pruitt took it. I gave it to him on purpose. He held it in his hand like a man being handed something heavier than its weight, and he looked at it, and then he looked at me, and he said, Aye, Admiral, we'll keep it. And I believed him. That was the strange gift of the whole thing. I had walked onto that ship unable to trust the man at the brow, and I was walking away from that ceremony able to hand him the most precious object I own and believe him when he said he would keep it. The standard had done that. Not me. The standard. That night the sea went flat, and the next morning is where I started this story. The morning after, though it was really many mornings after, all of them running together into the settled peace of a command that has found its footing. I stood in the flag cabin with my coffee going cold and watched the light come up gray and even over water without a wrinkle in it, and I knew that no one on that ship would ever again meet me at a door and ask what I was doing there. Not because they were afraid of me, because they knew me, because the ship had decided who I was, at the brow, the way ships do, and it had decided right. I have been underestimated my whole life. If you are the kind of person who gets underestimated and you know who you are, then you already know the two ways people tell you to answer it. Prove them wrong, they say. Show them, make them eat it. And there is a place for that when you are young, when the slights are small. But I have lived long enough now to know a better answer, and I want to leave it with you, because it is the truest thing I know. The best answer to being told you do not belong is not to prove them wrong loudly. It is to belong so completely, so quietly, so all the way to the bone, that the question simply stops making sense. You do not have to win the moment at the brow. You only have to be, in the end, exactly who you always were, and let the ship decide. It will. It always does. And when it does, the piece of it is worth more than every sharp answer you ever swallowed to get there. The sea was flat as a coin that morning. The ensign snapped clean at the stern in a good wind. The brow below it was manned and correct, with a dead man's pipe in the hands of the watch, and I was, at long last and without hurry, home. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end of this one. I have been thinking, ever since that morning, about how quickly we decide who belongs and who does not, often before a person has said a single word. So let me ask you, have you ever been turned away by someone who was certain they had you figured out? And when it was finally your turn to hold a little power over someone who had wronged you, did you reach for the sharp answer or the quiet one? I read every comment, and I would truly like to know. If this story hit home for you, leave a comment and tell me about it. And if it meant something, hit subscribe and keep your standard.